fundamental processes of running an assessment stem from the IPCC and the way that they've established their processes. We have to modify that slightly to try and address the complexity of the area we're working with.
It's going to be an iterative process in the sense that, again, what's being proposed for IPBES is that there's actually a dialogue between the policymakers and the scientific community in what kinds of questions should be addressed.
What we can do from a scientific point of view is to present to policymakers consequences of decisions that can be made into the future in terms of what is going to happen if you make a decision A, or you make a decision B, or a decision C, and then we have to leave it up to them to make the right decision.
You don't have ecosystem services without biological diversity. Services are derived from biological diversity. The complexity of communities and the numbers of species and how they interact determine the kinds of services you get. So it's one's derived from the other.
It is a very complex field, well, as all of them are, but this is particularly complex in the sense that it ties together not only biodiversity but also ecosystem services and how that impacts on human livelihood options around the world.
The challenge would be for IPBES is to set up a process whereby the information, whether it is written information or whether it's tested information, how is that documented and validated by not the scientific community but by that own community. They set up their own standards, they set up their own verification system, and based on that system, the ones that pass that bench test will be used in the analysis.
Once again, welcome to the United Nations University headquarters here in Tokyo. The first workshop was for the first plenary held in Nairobi in the last October. And we tried out to structuralize the basic framework of the IPBES assessment processes. And the next meeting will be organized in April in Panama. This workshop needs to be focused more on the concrete process of the assessment and what will be the very important essence of the assessment, which is particularly important in IPBES.
I'm going to be presenting the results of the survey that we took between January 8th and February 1st, 2012. This survey was confined to looking at only the assessment component and to some extent the governance structure for implementation.
We were really surprised that we had about 2,300 odd participants who opened the survey and filled in some parts, but with 1,600 which basically hit the submit button. So that's a really good response rate. The other thing which adds credibility in terms of representativeness of the scientific community that needs to be engaged in for IPBES. Because IPBES to be successful has to have the engagement of the scientists because they're going to be doing the work and they're going to be doing it pro bono, which means it has to excite them. They're not going to get paid for this. And we got 136 countries, scientists from 136 countries. So we got a good representation. So that's the first thing that we were really surprised. Now in terms of the results, I think one of the, I would sort of classify into 4 categories. The first is this really strong urge by the scientists to have independence. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't want governments involved, but they want a process which is scientifically independent and where they can basically take the best information, generate the information without any undue political pressure. And I'm not only saying governments, I'm even talking about NGOs with certain specific agendas. So science is allowed to do what science needs to do. And I think it provides a perfect opportunity to really build the trust between policymakers, stakeholders, and science. So we've got that one, and that's a challenge. Now the second is the transdisciplinary. There was an overwhelming response, about nearly 90%, which says we really need to have a transdisciplinary approach. But when we drill down into the data set, we don't have a really good representation of social sciences. We try to reach out as as executive director of IHDP, that's one of our biggest networks, and it was really difficult. So this is a challenge for us, for IPBES, to how to mobilize the social sciences to really get engaged and bring in that knowledge into IPBES. Then the third is the process, an open and transparent process. So following up on the independence. The scientists were very, very clear on the selection of scientists, how they should be selected, and how the reviewing process is. And that's really important, because if that's not done in a proper way, then you lose the trust of the really good scientists. They would walk away from the process. So that has to be really put into place at the very beginning, and that's one of the main items we are going to be deliberating over the next 3 days here in Tokyo, and to provide some guidance based on the feedback that we got from the survey to the second intersessional meeting for IPBES, and hopefully it would be taken on board. And the last key message would be the role of the UN agencies. And it's interesting that the scientific community wants the UN agencies in, even for mobilizing the scientific community, but to be working very closely with the scientific communities, either through their organizations, either the international global level, like some of the global change programs like IHDP, which is the International Human Dimensions Program, and Diversitas, which handles biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also regional bodies, because there has been a lot of attention that IPBES should really be functional at the regional level, because biodiversity, unlike climate change, is very place-based, happens at the local scales, and it needs to be captured explicitly. So there is a call for an equal partnership between the UN agencies and the scientific organizations representing the respective scientific communities to make sure that IPBES gets implemented well, efficiently.
It's the same in it's trying to get government support for a scientific assessment, so a collaboration between the scientific community and the policy community. That's a similarity. The difference between the two, which will play out in governance, is that the IPBES will focus both on the regional as well as the global, where the IPCC has focused more on the global assessment of how climate is changing, because by the very nature of biodiversity, which is more local, so there's going to be an attempt to do regional assessments and then work up to the global. That's the number one difference. Number two, IPCC serves one convention, the climate convention. IPBES will serve multiple conventions, the biodiversity convention, migratory species, desertification, all the environmental related conventions. So that'll be a big difference also, which will play out in the governance a bit. But exactly how the governance will work will depend a little bit more on negotiations, but this difference between doing local versus global makes a huge difference, because that means more there'll be more information from local level, which will bring in more traditional knowledge as well as scientific, Western-based science. So there'll be a marriage between the two at the local level. So there's a lot of differences. How independent these regional assessments will be, I think there's a general feeling that whatever the dispersion is, there has to be a unified conceptual framework and some unified metrics for doing things. You can't compare different places if they've done it in different ways. So, but I think the regional areas, the local areas will want a lot of freedom to conduct it in their own way, but still there has to be some uniformity. So that's going to be the little tug of war that's going to be there.
I have, however, been very much involved with this whole discussion about the creation of IPBES since the early beginnings. So I'm quite interested in this agenda and seeing this discussion finally being concluded. So I'm looking forward to this next meeting in Panama and to the recommendations that this meeting here in Tokyo will forward to it. I hope IPBES will play an important role, just as the IPCC has been very critical for the decisions on climate change. Biodiversity is a very complex issue. There's a lot of uncertainties and there's a lot of conflicts of interest. So bringing the results of science in a more consolidated way and in a more policy relevant way should help decision making about biodiversity at all levels, at global, regional, national and subnational levels. So that's what we're looking forward to. The UNU has a long tradition of following the political discussions on biodiversity, especially as part of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there's a lot of expertise here at the United Nations University, and I believe UNU can play an even more significant role in supporting the work of IPBES and the support of the parties, the countries themselves, in terms of decision-making for biodiversity.
The government of Japan, especially the Minister of the Environment of Japanese government, thinks the IPBES is one of the most important organization which has been establishing since the CBD Convention itself. And because all the government should develop their policies based on the scientific knowledge and assessment. And we need more integration between the science and the policy. So in that context, the Japanese government thinks the IPBES is very important. And also, in case of Japanese government, especially the Minister of the Environment, has a lot of experiences on the biodiversity assessments, especially in domestic fields. And also we have a lot of good relationship with scientists. The IPBES might be one of the most important and which we can contribute to the actual implementation of the IPBES works.
I would say it wouldn't be a far stretch by broadening into sustainable development, but sustainable development has a lot of baggage. And one has to be careful that IPBES does not get bogged down by that baggage. I would focus on human development. I would focus on economic development, because these are the major themes that are on the minds of a lot of policy makers. And I would go on record by saying that IPBES could be the mechanism that the Secretary General has recently called for a global sustainability panel. And IPBES would provide that, because sustainability is ecosystems and sustainability is human development. These are the two critical elements for IPBES. So there you go. Much of the dynamics of the ecosystems, biodiversity interaction, and in fact human livelihoods actually occurs on those very local scales. The challenge here is people talk about I think you used the word traditional knowledge, because it doesn't mean that all local and indigenous knowledge is going to be good knowledge. You need to even validate that, just like we do in the scientific arena. So I think IPBES, there is much talk about in IPCC, but I think in IPBES we have identified, actually we have recommended a subgroup, an expert subgroup, to actually look at this and to provide some guidance on this validation process.
We also have to make sure that we have a very broad disciplinary or transdisciplinary representation on all our activities, to make sure that we don't neglect areas of work that could improve our understanding as far as the changes that are happening in the physical world, but also in the biodiversity, but also then as far as the consequences for human livelihood options are concerned. It will always remain the role and responsibility of political office bearers to make policy. We can't do that. We're not mandated to do that, and frankly we're not trained and we don't have the background to do that. We have to leave it up to them to make the right decision. And so what we do is give them policy options, if you like, or not necessarily policy options, but at least gives them decision-making options that they can consider. And then it's up to them to make the best call.